Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and I've been preparing something else, and so instead of including it in this series, I'm going to just put it separately and focus on De Materia Medica by Pedanius Dioscorides. Very first century Greek/Roman era uh, medicine herbal book, and it's been published throughout time for many centuries. So from the earliest edition up until the Middle Ages, it was still pretty much the standard textbook to do with herbs and medicines. And even up until the 19th century, it was still very important. And here's like a later version, translation, and one of the more older ones we could see it's written in the Greek. And the focus of this video will be what you see there, and those are mandrakes, or mandragora. The Materia Medica, this is the Juliana Anicia Codex, or the Vienna Dioscorides as they call it, from approximately 515 AD, and this is one of the earliest illustrated herbal books, very important, and because of the age as well, and it will relate to all these series that I'm going to be posting in regards to some of these things. Now, not just for okay, we'll get to that, but just even the style of the illustrations is pretty cool in that particular one. These are Arabic translations. This De Materia Medica was very important, widespread text in regards to herbs and medicines, but medicines also include minerals and metals as well, so it was not strictly purely a herbal book, it was a medicine book. So the 1554 edition, but here we see from the Juliana Codex this surviving illustration, and that's important because it's related to Mandrake, and you might notice that there is a dog hanging from underneath. So here we see Dioscorides receiving a mandrake, and this mandrake being so important as a ancient medicine for, and also related to medieval witchcraft, these other elements. It's still very, very strongly connected with magic. So as far as herbs and plants go, mandrake is the magic one of back to antiquity. One of the reasons is because it looks like a homunculus, like a little person. So in Eliphas Levi, that famous image of Baphomet, in his book he also speaks of the mandrake, connects it to Paracelsus and the concept of a homunculus, which is a miniature man. In alchemy such as by Geber, they speak one of the ambitions of alchemists were to create artificial life, and that was to create a homunculus, a miniature man, and well, this herb having magical properties, because the actual properties of it are very unique, but also it looks magical in that sense. So mandrake is a hallucinogenic, it's a trip, okay, and it's a narcotic. Narcotic comes from the Greek word narco, which means to make numb. In Dioscorides, he describes how a wine made from mandrake produces anesthesia. So this is one of the earliest references to anesthesia, anesthetics, and the original translation of that should mean a loss of sensation. So early physicians such as Galen, who were there was a lot of battles going on in those times. There were a lot of wounds. You can even see in, for instance, the Edwin Smith papyrus of ancient Egypt, they talk about trauma injuries, but the need of an anesthetic would be an important one, and mandrake is an anesthetic. It's also hallucinogenic, so enter a Joe Rogan meme there. It's also interesting because what I'll be covering in the videos I've planned ahead is the connection between the Hermetic era, especially with people such as Athanasius Kircher, connections to the Voynich manuscript, connections to apocryphy, and how this goes back in time and back to the early Greek period and the influence of the Babylonians, Chaldeans, and the ancient Egyptians on these. Now, there's not many texts left from the ancient past, but through Dioscorides and those few surviving fragments from Mesopotamia and Egypt, we can see this connection. But that's an illustration from the Voynich manuscript. Now, no one's cracked the code of the language, however, and I'll cover this in more detail soon, but the illustrations are mostly herbal. Then there's a small section on astronomy or astrology, and then there's several pages which show apothecary jars connected to a particular plant. So a herb would be stored in a particular shape jar made of whether it be glass or a ceramic jar, which blends with the apocryphy medical texts of earlier up until Middle Ages through to the Renaissance. So there's a Mandrake connection, and even using the roots as an anesthetic. Mandrakes are mentioned in the Bible, Old Testament, for instance, pay for play, I suppose. So Reuben found some mandrakes, and then he bribed Rachel, and I'm not sure if I can say that word, but the oldest profession connected to mandrakes in the Old Testament. It's also in the Song of Solomon, number 7. Also interesting, the connection in regards to wine and grapes, and because mandrake would be often blended with wine as one of the ways of serving it. Mandrake the Magician was a popular cartoon back at the time, and you might recognize this image from recent movies. Here's an older image of a witch with mandrake and flying witches. Now I include that both here because we also see the Strix, or Striga as we call it in the old language, old country where my parents originate, witchcraft as well, and very important in witchcraft. So witches' flying ointments contain mandrake. They would also include deadly nightshade and a few other poisons, but that's how during the witch hunting period and that type, well, mandrakes were very magical. Also, if you harvested a mandrake, it was often said you would go to hell. Mandrake in potions for the Sabbath and Bacchanalians, Bacchus, as they called them, ceremonies of drunkenness and debauchery, and those typical images of witchcraft from back in the day. Here we see some mandrake roots, and you can see now, not always. So if you could get just like in China now, if you get a ginseng root that looks like a human, it has huge more value than one that just looks rather random. So a mandrake root was valuable. A mandrake root that looked like a human was very, very valuable. So old editions of Dioscorides, De Materia Medica, you can see, and also the later in Arabic from Spain. But the connections between mandrake as a male and a female plant, depending on the shape, so they would have different aspects. So even in Hortus Sanitia, what's the name of it, the text? But again, mandrakes as being either a male or a female form. One that looked human, valuable. If you could separate one that looked particularly male or one that looked particularly female, would have its own applications and again increase the value of the plant. In regards to separating herbs, so Dioscorides and other ancient writers, Pliny, Theophrastus, separated herbs into a male or a female aspect, and still now, dark rubies are considered male, lighter gems are female. According to Josephus and other ancient writers, a darker mandrake would be more feminine and a white mandrake would be considered more male. But in alchemy, herbal, apothecary, that this division between male and female aspects is an important one, because for instance this is the work of Isaac Newton, during his alchemical period, and you can see the symbols, for instance, Mercury, the moon, Mars, the sun, and Venus, which were connected to particular metals as well as gods such as Aphrodite or Venus. But he also separates them into masculine and female. So masculina sanguina. So you also have the 4 humours, but femina, 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 masculina, masculine, masculine. And the way to separate and divide and class things. So, but for most people, probably you've seen the Harry Potter movies and the screaming Mandrake, where they, well, the thing would scream. This concept of a screaming Mandrake has ancient origins, and the dangers of a screaming Mandrake if it's improperly harvested. So again, if you don't harvest, as the legend goes, of course, it's not, not in real life, but if you don't harvest a Mandrake properly, it will scream and it would either drive you mad or kill you, as is the saying goes. And this will be something I'll be covering in these upcoming videos in regards to even, for instance, frankincense. There will, and these other very valuable medicinal incense herbs that usually had some sort of psychoactive substance. It was very often a legend connected to it of its danger if improperly harvested or used, and seems to be like to scare the people off, in a sense. It's seems to be more the exception than the rule that Mandrake and these other plants have some scary legend attached to them. So back in from the Juliana Anicia Codex, and we see Dioscrides receiving the Mandrake. We also notice the dog bear underneath. Here are various images well, throughout time and periods where we see again the Mandrake connected to a dog, and this one you can see how he's only partially harvested, and again here, and you can see the rope tied between the dog and the Mandrake, again the Mandrake and the dog connected, and here as well you can see that the dog is connected to the Mandrake. If the Mandrake was dangerous, so you can even see in these Arabian images from in regards to the Mandrake and the dog, and again here, and notice that this guy is covering his ears, because the concept was that you would partially dig out the Mandrake root, but if once you ripped it out it would scream, and that would either send you mad or kill you. So what the idea was, you would partially dig it out, then you would attach it to a starving dog, you would throw a piece of meat, the dog would chase the meat, the dog would pull the Mandrake out, and thus the dog would die from harvesting the Mandrake, not the person. Josephus and other ancient texts, more of the medieval period speaks of that, but this has ancient origins, and it's again across the Mediterranean region that this tradition, this legend has been passed on. Mandrakes grow in current day Israel, were native there. Is evidence to suggest that Tutmosis, along with many other plants that he imported from this region, brought mandrakes into Egypt. Maybe they might have been there already, but definitely amongst many other plants, Tutmosis, after a victorious campaign in Syria, imported a lot of medicinal plants, and here we can see the mandrake fruit in these glass faience beads, part of a pendant. There's a passing mandrake fruits around, and we can even see in the garden the mandrake there in Egypt. And there are many papers on this in regards to how mandrake was a important plant used in Egypt, and because again it's an anesthetic, it's hallucinogenic, just like the water lily, frankincense, of course cannabis sativa as well, and why these plants were so important and so often found in tombs, etc. So mandrake, screaming mandrake connected to a dog to harvest it. It's a very ancient use of this plant, well recorded across the Mediterranean region, and still one of those plants that, and the legends connected to it because of, well, the actual plant, people still using mandrake. Don't do it, be careful what you do it, yeah. But also how this is passed on in popular fiction as well, and the mandrake as well. So I didn't want to, do you want to include this in the history section, so just as a separate one-off in regards to looking at mandrakes, screaming mandrakes, and these legends connected to them, because I'll be looking at De Materia Medica and Dioscrides, and how these other ancient texts were actually, if you want to call it, the original corpus hermetica, and that's why we saw that explosion of science, engineering, etc. Not the Hermeticum, but it was actually these other books such as De Materia, 10 books of architecture, etc. Cheers, have a good one.